You know, vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein monster, all the Universal classics, they've gotten millions and millions of movies over the years. You know, not even just about Dracula and the Wolfman, just werewolf movies up the ass. Vampires everywhere. But what about killer mummies? The Mummy is one of the staples of the classic Universal Monsters lineup, yet there's really not that many killer mummy movies. Sure, mummies show up as like scares in a lot of other movies just for one scene, but there's very few movies that just revolve around killer mummies. As I kind of proved with a video last year, there's probably more killer mermaid horror films than there even are mummy horror films. But there are still mummy movies out there, so let's take a look at those. Let's go back, way back, and travel to modern times and try to find the best mummy movie other than the Universal Monster movies. So when most people hear The Mummy, the first thing they think of is Universal Studios. I personally think of the classic 1932 Boris Karloff film. It's admittedly not my favorite of the original Universal Monsters catalog. I do love it, but there are things I don't like about it. It's sort of a rehash of Dracula in a lot of ways. It has really essentially the same plot. And it even has Edward Van Sloan playing essentially Van Helsing in the movie. There's just things about it I don't like as much as, say, The Wolfman or Creature from the Black Lagoon or The Invisible Man. But it's still a great film. It was followed up by a lot of sequels like The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Hand, and all that. Plenty of sequels. It's actually one of the biggest series within the Universal Monsters franchise. But it's admittedly not the best. It's fun to watch them all, and they're real short, but they get very redundant after a while. Every movie is essentially the same thing. Rather than having Imhotep, who was a smart and haunting and crafty villain like in the first movie, we're reduced to Cadiz, or Caris, or Caris, whatever you want to call him, who's just a pawn that's just used by the villain of the film. It's different every week. There's always just another villain who wants to control Caris to kill a bunch of people and get the Princess Ananka to be reawakened in this time so the mummies can be together and get them power and control somehow. But then the bad guy always falls in love with whoever is the descendant of Ananka, and the same plot ensues. The most interesting turn it almost took is in the final one, when the girl who was killed at the end of the last movie awakens from the swamp as like a mummy herself. And it's actually kind of an eerie scene, and the makeup is so good. She looks so cool. But then she just walks into a river and she's just a normal living pretty girl again, and she's not a mummy. And it's like, that would have been a cool twist to have a new mummy character. Like, the old curse is over, but it lives on in her. But they didn't go with that. But I think what most people think of when they hear Universal Mummy is the Brendan Fraser movies from the late 90s and the early 2000s. These are fun adventure romps, but for me personally, I just never really got into them. When they came out, I saw them as like too special effects CG heavy. Even back then, I thought the CG looked awful in all of the movies. You know, everyone jokes about the Scorpion King at the end of the second one, but I even thought Imhotep looked crappy in the first one when he's like reforming and stuff, and I never really cared about the face in the sand. I know it was impressive stuff at the time for what they could do with CG, but they just weren't really for me, I guess. They're not like horror, they're just like Indiana Jones, but they're really comedic. There's a ton of jokes in them, and I didn't find the jokes terribly funny. I don't know, like, they're not bad movies, but to me, they don't have much of a unique identity to me that really stands out. I just don't think of them when I think of mummy horror films. But we're not really counting Universal or Hammer, because those are like the staples of most of the classic monsters. It would be so easy to just do, okay, search for the spookiest, vampires, Dracula, 1931, best one. Search for the spookiest, werewolves, The Wolfman, 1941. You know, it's so easy to do that, and I would, because I love the Universal monster movies. But I think personally, we need to look at other studios, you know, other films that aren't connected to the Universal Monsters or the Hammer horror series. The only other running series I can really think of about mummies is the Aztec Mummy trilogy. Every single one of them was filmed in 1957 in Mexico. They were later dubbed in English and brought to America. The first one, simply called The Aztec Mummy, was renamed to Attack of the Mayan Mummy, which is weird. I don't know why they couldn't just leave it as The Aztec Mummy, but that's definitely the best of the trilogy. It's not great. It's kind of your generic, you know, horror B-movie schlock from the era, but it's got everything you want from it. It has a lot of cool, like, Mayan tomb scenery and, you know, a lot of just tribal imagery and rituals and all that stuff you'd like to see in a film like this. The Mummy does look pretty effectively creepy in some films for a really low budget, and they do some of the classic shots, you know, like the exploring the tomb in the dark. There's a lot of, you know, moody atmosphere, and there's the classic scene of the monster breaks into the sleeping girl's room at night, and he slowly creeps towards the bed, and she faints, and he carries her away in his arms, that you've seen a million times before from the era. But it's all done pretty well. It's not amazing, but, you know, for the small budget, it's definitely an interesting film. I think, honestly, the American version that they made later on, where they added some scenes filmed in the US, is a little worse, because a lot of those scenes are just really sluggish and long, and they don't need to be. I do think that's the movie's one problem, is there's just a bit too much drawn out scenes. The sequel, Curse of the Aztec Mummy, is really forgettable. It's honestly not worth watching. It's funny because it has the luchador El Angel in it, but I mean, aside from that, there's really nothing special about it. It's kind of just same old thing. I mean, the whole series really just copies the plot of the Universal Mummy, where this ancient mummy, you know, rises from his tomb, and he wants a modern woman who is the descendant of the mummy princess that he wants to marry. It's the exact same plot. In this one, again, like, it's pretty boring. You don't even get a satisfying scene at the end where, like, a luchador, you know, kills the mummy or anything. The ending is very not satisfying, to say the least. Many scenes in this movie are incredibly slow and drawn out. There's a scene with, you know, cars just driving. I guess it's supposed to be this exciting chase, but it is like the most boring thing you've ever seen. Just long shots of just a car from the background driving into the foreground, then another vehicle driving from the background into the foreground. It just goes on and on. It's like several minutes. It's just pure filler. Third film in the series, with a title that would make you think it's the greatest one in the trilogy, The Robot versus the Aztec Mummy, is sadly nowhere near as great as its title. Whatever your mind comes up with when you hear that title is far greater than what you're actually going to see in the movie. Most of it is very slow and boring. A huge portion of it, almost half of the film, is just a recap of the past two movies that is just recycled footage from the first film mostly. They take entire scenes from the first film and just re-show them again. When you finally get to the robot being made, it's just as ridiculous as you would want it to look. It looks like it's made out of tinfoil and cardboard. And I want to say that you should just fast forward to the end and watch the battle of the Aztec Mummy fighting the robot, but sadly it's really not as funny as you would think it would be. Sure, you'll get some laughs out of it. They both walk at each other like they're about to, you know, go in for a hug, and the fight is just a bunch of shots back and forth of them doing nothing, just standing there, every now and then throwing a pathetic punch and some sparks or smoke flying out. But it goes on way too long. It's really dull, and eventually the mummy just gets tired of that crap, and he just rips that robot to pieces easily because it's a bunch of cardboard. And then he comes after the bad guys. The bad guys just kind of die. They just disappear. And then the heroes come over and give him his treasures and say, here you go, take these back to the tomb, we will never bother you ever again. And it ends. It doesn't end. There's a huge scene at the end of just characters talking, but it ends. It's very anticlimactic. Again, this trilogy is not good. The only one I'd say is worth watching is the first film. But even then, it's charming for the budget and the time period and stuff, but I don't think it's even the best silly horror film you can see from this era. It's just not bad. It won't disappoint. But let's move a lot further forward into 1981 with Dawn of the Mummy. This is a strange movie. It's very reminiscent of that time, the late 70s and the early 80s, cheaper kind of movies from that era. It's about a bunch of models who, for some reason, are doing a photo shoot in an old tomb in Egypt. So basically, a bunch of pretty people stumbling into a dangerous situation. I don't know why this photographer insists on going to Egypt and going into an actual tomb to shoot this. They would never do that in real life. You would just make a set in a studio that looks like an old tomb. But for some reason, they have to do the real thing. So a bunch of pretty people just kind of stumble into this. Some overactor douchebag just steals a bunch of gold from the mummy's tomb, and that pisses the mummy off. So then he starts going after everybody and killing people one by one. There's this pretty glorious scene where you get this really rad, badass synth music playing, and a whole bunch of zombies of the old slaves of the mummy are risen from the grave, and they just come at everybody and just start killing everybody. It gets surprisingly gory for something with this low a budget, but it's not convincing. But it's still, the effects on the zombies is pretty good. The zombies look pretty cool. And the mummy himself doesn't look too bad either. It has a pretty awesome explosion at the end. You can't beat practical explosions and burning buildings and everything. But the movie is very low budget, and everything's pretty cheesy and stupid in the film. But I do think it has its merit. It's not the greatest thing ever, but it's a decent effort. It's definitely a fun movie to get a bunch of friends together, just eat junk food and watch a dumb film together. Well, damn, we went all the way back to the 50s, then through the 80s, and there's still not that many mummy movies to talk about. I told you, they're rare. They're really not that common. You take Universal out of the situation, and there's just not that many mummies. But the last one I'm going to talk about came much later in the 2000s. We're talking Bubba Hotep. Now, this movie's not as obscure as it used to be. I think things like James Rolfe's, Cinemassacre Monster Madness brought light to it back in 2007. And I think a lot of just, horror buffs or horror comedy buffs have been, talking about this movie. But it stars the great Bruce Campbell playing, questionably, Elvis Presley. We don't know if he's really Elvis Presley. He lives at this retirement home, and he says he's Elvis Presley. He dresses like him, like he's wearing what he would be wearing in Vegas, and he's got the hair, and he's got the sunglasses, and the accent, and everything. But we don't know for sure if he's Elvis. He claims that the Elvis who died was actually a decoy who took over after he was sick of being in the limelight all these years and just wanted to live a normal life. So we don't really know if he's Elvis or not. He meets a man in a wheelchair who's a black man who claims to be John F. Kennedy. Same situation where he says he didn't actually die. And, we don't know how in his mind he could be John F. Kennedy, but we just go along with it. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. And it's kind of nice because they become close friends and allies. In a world where no one really takes them seriously anymore, no one really respects them. In a nursing home, no one really respects you, regardless of how great you might have once been. No one cares. So even if he wasn't Elvis, it's kind of symbolic for the fact that no one cares what you might have done in the past. You could have been John F. Kennedy, you could have been Elvis, but no one really cares about you in a nursing home, sadly. And everyone treats you like a child. But they're actually onto something. There's a cowboy mummy coming around, sucking the souls of the patients out of their assholes. And only they know what's happening, and they team up to take him down. It is a bizarre premise, but it is a hilarious and really fun movie, honestly, and it's definitely worth a watch. Bruce Campbell is amazing as always. So I would say, as odd as it is, and it's more of a comedy than a horror film, I would say the best Mummy movie, not by Universal, is Bubba Hotep. I hope you enjoyed this trip down the history of mummy horror films. This has been the search for the spookiest. I'll see you on the next one. Do all the liking and subscribing and the sharing and the bell stuff.